Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 13 of the Focus Stack podcast. I can't believe it's already been 13 episodes in just a little over 2 months. So thank you for everybody who's been watching on all the different platforms. If you could do me a favor, please don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, however you like to listen to the show. Also, if you'd like to follow the show on Instagram, I do post updates on the Instagram page. You'll see some shorts and announcements whenever episodes go live. So that's at Focus Stack Podcast on Instagram. This is something I've just started promoting in the last 3 episodes, but I do have a Patreon set up. If you'd like to help support the show, it does help offset the cost of the streaming software. You could become a Focus Friend on Patreon for just $3 a month, and that also gives you the opportunity to ask questions to upcoming guests, as you'll get updates before I record each show. Also, if you're a photographer and you want to be a guest on the show, in the description and all the different platforms, there is a link to sign up. All you got to do is just fill out that form, and I'll be in touch with you as soon as I can get a chance to check out your portfolio, and we'll set up a time to record. So with all of that in mind, today's episode is going to be a little bit different, because what we're going to do is we're going to talk about photography, not necessarily always as the end result, but as part of the process. And my guest today is Drék Davis. He's a professor, a multidisciplinary artist, and the head of the Department of Visual and Performing Arts at Grambling State University in Louisiana. Although photography isn't his primary medium, it's central to how he shapes and refines his ideas for his larger bodies of work. By interweaving history, politics, and pop cultural references, Drék offers inclusive reflections on the American experience from an African-American perspective. So with all of that, let's welcome Drék Davis to the show. Hey, how you doing?
I'm all right. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. How's your day going so far?
It has been an interesting day. This is the first day of summer session 1, which means that just about anything that can go wrong will go wrong.
Okay.
An online class, and students have already started not reading the instructions for how to navigate the class. So that's pretty much been the extent of my morning, trying to assist students and dodge other responsibilities during this time of the year.
Oh, I get it. I've been there before too. Oh, so summers are pretty busy there.
Yeah, summer's crazy. Well, it's not super busy, but it's busy enough that it can be a distraction, especially if you're the department head, because we have to teach a class every semester. And so I'm trying to make sure that I'm on hand for students, obviously, but also I need to attend to all these other administrative things that we can't get to during the spring semester, which is really what summer is supposed to be for, working on grants and professional development and personal professional development and all those things you're trying to squeeze into the span of 2 months. So that's what my summers look like. But I think I'm on track to actually get some decent work done before the fall hits.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, one of the ways that we like to start out the show is just if you could just talk to us a little bit about your relationship to photography and how it's kind of factored into your work.
Well, the funny thing is that I've been using a camera, making images since about the 3rd grade. Most of the work that I create that is associated with quote unquote fine art began in kindergarten, like most people, drawing, painting, all that kind of stuff. But my mother gave me one of her cameras to take to school with me one day. And, I've been using a camera since then. Most of the images that I have from childhood, classroom activities, trips and things of that nature, I shot with her Kodak disc camera, I think is what it was, back in the early 1980s. And I wound up discovering some of those photos when I went home in undergrad in the mid to late 1990s. And I completely forgot about them. But it triggered this memory that, this is something that I'd always been doing, because at that point I had taken basic photography in undergrad. And I wound up, seeing this through line, because there are a few people in my family that are photographers. My grandfather was kind of an amateur photographer, and my uncle is a degreed photographer. He's the first person in my family that I can think of that has a degree in fine arts. He graduated with a degree in photography from the Atlanta Art Institute when it was still in existence. And so that, was one of two of the instances that really kind of solidified in my mind, this understanding that photography is indeed an art, and this is one of the ways that I can express myself. But up until that point and beyond that point, quite honestly, I had always been focused on drawing and painting because that was my intent and course of study in undergrad. But during that entire time, I was always, somewhere near a camera, carrying a camera, whether it be Polaroid or otherwise. The images were not always, decent or perfect, but, the idea of documenting what was happening around me, was important. And I've come to understand that camera is not only a way for me to document, but also a form of therapy of sorts, as a way for me to kind of not disconnect, but to decompress and to find another way to be objective in spaces that I might not necessarily always have some sort of buffer between me and everything else, especially in consideration with regard to the rest of the work that I do in my personal studio practice. That gives me a literal different lens to look at things through and a way to process things.
Well, that's great. Do you want me to go ahead and pull up your website? And I don't know if you want to start cruising through some work and
Sure.
just we can see the type of work you create. Here we go. So, also known as Professor Davis.
Exactly.
Where would you like me to go on the website?
I think I have a link to some photography.
Sure.
Most of the stuff that I shoot is probably on my Instagram page, but let's meander through the website and just take a quick look.
Yeah.
So down at the bottom, there should be a photography link. So images that, I selected obviously specifically for the website because most of the work that I have on the site is mixed media, found object heavy, and some of the digital work that I do, which is, pretty much the encapsulation of the way that I work in my primary studio practice. But when I'm thinking about photography, there's a handful of things that I wound up doing with regard to the subject matter and the themes. I'm interested in urban landscape photography. I'm always cloud watching. There's birds and there's graffiti. Most of my intention is thinking about composing things with regard to high key value. Because I think introduction to art making had always been about graphite pencils, so I'm always thinking about values in that regard. So the black and white is not just a stand-in for that, but I feel like black and white photography is much more personable to me. There's something much more evocative with regard to the comparison to color photography. And this is regularly talking to students in art appreciation about the division between auteurs and commercial photographers in the early part of the 20th century. It's like, pure photographers are trying to figure out a way to distinguish themselves, a la Alfred Stieglitz. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that I always think about, because I'm not trying to tell people what to think specifically when I'm really focusing on a particular, image in a theme that I'm addressing in the work that I'm trying to craft, but I'm trying to capture the mood. It's kind of like the same thing that painters say when they talk about being influenced by music, that they're not trying to paint the music, they're trying to paint the feeling that one gets when they listen to the music. And I like the depth of the values that you get when you're thinking about black and white. There's something much more evocative, as I stated, to me. At least it speaks to me in a way that I think even some of the most perfectly rendered color photographs that I've ever made, don't speak to me. There's something about the contrast and the push and pull between the blacks and the whites and the grays.
Well, and black and white, when you process an image in black and white, you kind of separate it from reality in some ways, mm-hmm. Which maybe there's something to that in terms of just the more expressive qualities to that. Yep,
and I think the starkness of the image is also in contrast to a lot of things that exist in my daily existence, especially when it comes to work, that there aren't always a lot of clear dividing lines when we talk about certain machinations in academia, but also in different parts of my studio practice. It's that, there's a lot more improvisation with some of the other things that I do as opposed to photography. When I'm out with the camera, I see an image and I'm trying to capture it in that moment so that I can convey what I see immediately in front of that lens. And that's not the same thing that happens when I go into the studio with an idea about a collage or a piece of sculpture. Is that, something could go left and I have to be willing to pivot with that. I don't, think about editing or altering photographs when I make them. On the flip side, if anything, I may apply a filter and adjust things in Photoshop with regard to kind of pushing value some, but I'm not trying to do anything super fancy. I really try to keep the image as raw as possible because I'm always thinking about evidence of the artist's hand in whatever medium I'm working in, and I want people to not only see but also feel that this is something that a real person did. And of course, that goes back to the conversation difference between commercial photographers and fine art photographers and auteurs and things in the early part of the 20th century. So that's something that always kind of resonates with me.
So do you have your students read that article by Stieglitz where he kind of breaks down the auteur and there's like the technical, the auteur, and I'm trying to think of how he breaks it down, but there's the artist, the professional, and the technical, right?
Yeah. We talk about that in every art appreciation class, and of course I cover it in art history as well. That it definitely resonates with our majors in the department, but I also think that it resonates some with some of the students who are just taking general education courses, who are also closet artists, but don't tell people, because I want them to understand that the individuals that we're covering in these books are real people who are oftentimes thinking about the same things that we all think about. It's like, how can I best convey these emotions? And these are the tools that we have at our disposal in order to try to convey what we feel in this moment. And that it's not just you capturing a selfie or taking a photograph of the meal that you had the night before. But there's something deeper that happens when you can compose an image that can crystallize a moment in time that you transmit to somebody else and they can pick up and feel what you're trying to say by sharing that image with them.
Yeah, I mean, there's something to, photography is very accessible in the way that it's in all of our phones and everything. Mm-hmm. And they probably, I wonder if you kind of, do you see the light bulb sort of like light up when they realize that they have the potential to create art in that sense?
I do on occasion, because I make art appreciation students make photographs. I have them capture still life, self-portrait, and an abstract image. We go through the work of Asher Cowens and Gordon Parks, and I give them the latitude to go and shoot. Usually, there's some trepidation because, we always have the student that says that, well, I'm not an artist, I'm not an XYZ. And I tell them the whole point of the exercise is for you to expand and take a risk. Is I'm not expecting perfection. I just want you to try to do something that is done, you just setting the timer and sitting in front of the camera and doing what we normally do. And then, they start to appreciate the other things that we're discussing in the classroom, because they place themselves in the people that we're talking about.
I think too, it's another way of like, if you're having trouble with creativity, it's just go out and shoot something, to kind of get past that block. Do you find that you see that happen in your own practice or in your students?
Every day, I'm always taking test shots. And at first I thought there was something wrong with me. There's that comedic moment that you have in sitcoms where, people look around to see if there's anybody else in the room, trying to break that imaginary fourth wall. And I'm wondering, like, why am I going through this process of trying to test out the cameras that I've been using forever? But there's always something about getting not just the technical part right, of course, but getting in the headspace, so that the rhythm is also right. Even though I'm usually shooting all the same types of things all the time, but there's always, just a handful of test images for me to kind of set the mood. And then, things just kind of fall into place.
Are there any of these images here that you'd want to like kind of spend some time with and talk about?
I like the piece underneath the Folsom piece. Yeah, this one right here in the center above the flowers.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was something that I shot on a cell phone, actually. I was in a pub here in Monroe, Louisiana, having lunch with some friends, and I just kind of whipped around and glanced and saw the corner of my eye. and thought, well, let me try to create a composition, using some of this text and these images on the wall and see what happens. And I knew that, some of the highs would be blown out, and I wanted that kind of distortion without having to do anything else to it. And I knew that from using that phone previously to shoot images, that the blacks would be rich. And that's something that I really wanted. One of the reasons that I got back into photography so heavily was that I had intended to, start using my own reference images so that I could get back into painting. But the painting never happened. I just kept shooting more and more photographs and more photographs. So now I have, tens of thousands of photographs that are organized and subfolders and all these different designations from nature and landscapes and ephemeral things and all this other stuff that, if I were to decide I wanted to create some compositions from images, that I could easily more or less kind of access these things. And the way that image is composed and, just the impromptu nature of it is the way that the images that I'm really serious about happen. When I'm taking photographs of clouds, it's really about me just kind of staring into the void and kind of decompressing, finding interesting shapes in the clouds like we used to do as kids. But when I'm really, thinking about, the images that I want to create that say something, it's usually something like the one here in the center. Part of my photography journey actually goes back to an undergrad drawing class. We wound up having a final project assignment where we had to create a series of images that were easily recognizable as a narrative. And the instructor in that course, Professor Judy McWillie from Tennessee, said, there's a class that you need to take because the images that I created were mixed media collages and drawing these film strip frames on Canson drawing paper that were like 7 feet long. And she said, there's a class you should take that will make it work much more better for the images that you're putting together. And the class wound up being Photoshop. But this was the early 1990s. So, I had to wait, a couple of quarters before I could get in there. But thinking about, taking images, which of course I just completed the basic photography class. So I had things that I could actually scan from negatives and also to scan the actual film and to the computer and manipulate that, added a literal and figurative way that I think about creating even to this day. And so that's another, point of juncture where the idea of photography as both a tool and a medium kind of solidified in my head. And so now, even though I'm not painting from the images, I'm still using them to compose things, doing pre-visualization for some of the works that I make in my quote unquote regular studio practice. And I am, taking time now to step back and think about, the seriousness with which I approach photography, because every now and again, someone will always ask me, so when are you going to have a photo show? And I'm thinking, never. Nobody wants to look at this stuff, I don't think, but, there is some connective tissue with the large majority of the things that I am seriously capturing. And so now I'm stepping back and trying to talk to some of my photography friends to help me kind of curate a possible exhibition that best represents, some of the things I've done over the handful of years here.
I was wondering if maybe you could take us to some work where you kind of see that connective tissue between the photographs and your regular studio practice. Let's
go to the digital works, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. And Blackout magazine. So it's not present in all of these, but a lot of these images are either photographs that I shot or photographs that I use as references that I'm then composing and or altering or reshooting, and some instances as well to lay out this faux magazine that I came up with one day in the late 1990s, early 2000s. One of the primary purposes of the magazine was to talk about representation, and I wanted to begin with images that would be directly associated with people of African descent, and in particular trying to figure out a way to situate myself in the work that was both literal and evocative in a way that a lot of my other work hasn't been or hadn't been up to that point, because I was, presenting myself as an outside participant to a lot of the things that I was addressing in my work. And I wanted to try to figure out a different way to connect myself directly to the pieces that I was, coming up with. And I was reminded that, we are sometimes our most reliable and cheapest model. I was trying to figure out, how to start photographing myself and photographing things that, that I had at my disposal that were representational of myself, to include as images and a lot of this work. And the same thing goes for some of the cut paper assemblages, collages that I've done as well. Trying to mine some of the images that I've shot over the years that are related to, a lot of the same images that have been utilized as staples in my visual vocabulary since, undergrad. Do
you want me to click on anyone in particular that we could take a look at?
So the one, I'm pointing at the screen as if you can see what I'm doing. The one beside clones with the eyes in it, that one there, yeah. So that is, self-portrait, or actually it's a couple different self-portraits that I did, just staring in the mirror one night after I got out of the shower. And I think I also shot this with a cell phone as well, as opposed to an actual real camera. But I was, thinking about the fact that, I often don't look at myself because I'm always the person behind the camera. Even when I'm not out shooting things, for my own personal pleasure, I'm usually the designated photographer for the art collective that I'm a member of, or for things in the department. If we need a backup photographer when the campus people can't be available, then I'm the one that's usually, shooting things. And it dawned on me that, I'm participating or attending all these things, but there's no real evidence that I was here, other than the fact that, I'm the one that has the files that these images come from. And so it made me really think about, my connection to the experiences that not only that I have, but the experiences that we have, especially in the time that we live in, that is situated around self-representation and actualization. And what does it mean to take a selfie to document, your time and space? And the fact that I didn't have a lot of those, digital documents, that I was a part of this thing. And so this wound up being like the foundations of me trying to explore, who I am and how I see myself, not only, but in relationship to other people. And the fact that, I had to acknowledge that I wasn't really comfortable looking at myself. That was the other thing. It's like, there are artists who regularly feature themselves in their work because, that's something that they've just always been comfortable with. But it was like the last thing that ever came to mind for me. And, with regard to photography in general, it is connected to this idea of Frederick Douglass, using photography as a way to document himself, as a rejection of the stereotypical images that existed with people of African descent, and Booker T. Washington, using photography as well to help to undo or try to undo some of the stereotypes that were associated with people of African descent in the early part of the 20th century. And so, I've kind of made a commitment to using images of myself in some form or fashion, when possible, as a way to connect myself to the things that I'm addressing in the work, so that people won't interpret my statements about the subject matter as being passive, but also as a way for me to commit to what it is that I'm saying with regard to, this really being like a legitimate representation of me and how I feel as well.
One of the things I appreciate about this is this sort of like experimental approach to graphic design, but also I can kind of see that therapeutic element that you were talking about earlier.
The idea of therapy, is something that, we talk about in the art collective that I'm a member of. It really came up as a joke because we have a range of meetups for just about every, creative discipline that there is, but it always winds up turning into, some sort of conversation beyond just the studio practice about, people's everyday lives. And, we are always talking about the fact that we assume that the creative activity that we're engaging in allows us a way to process the things that we're dealing with or trying to deal with or struggling with. But what happens when the medium is not allowing you to get the message out? And then you want to have this additional stress and frustration that's piled on top of, all of these concerns that you're trying to deal with, but it's coming from a technical perspective. and or from a creative perspective. And so, I always, wind up coming back to what you were saying about, the just going out and shooting. Just trying to remind people, it's like it's better to make than to not make. Even if you're just making a literal mark as opposed to trying to finish a piece, and not hanging your hat on this idea about perfection and how things are supposed to look and feel. Once you start working, then the work that you're supposed to make will eventually present itself to you. And getting into the right frame of mind is imperative, because especially for those of us that are trained as creatives, we tend to we believe that the things that we've always done are supposed to always work, and that there is a shortcut, that we fall into our own patterns that wind up being a trap as opposed to a liberating force. And that, and a lot of studio practices winds up, turning into creative block, because the things that have always worked don't work anymore, and people just don't know what to do next. And, I'd like to create opportunities for challenge whenever possible. And again, thinking about how photography is a part of that is something that, allows me a certain kind of freedom that I wouldn't have, I think, if all I were doing were just drawing and painting, which is what my original intention was, in undergrad. That, there's that additional, like literal layer, going back to Photoshop, to the processes that I already employ, that photography is, right? The camera is another tool in the toolbox, beside the paintbrushes, beside the X-Acto knives and the scissors and all that stuff, which is why I have, so many different cameras, because they all do something different, obviously, but they all literally feel different. That every camera that I have, even though I don't use them all the time, I know that I can elicit a certain type of feeling and look that I want to capture by using, an older, digital camera that, is quick and efficient, but it still feels like analog. And that's part of the other reason that I really love like shooting in black and white, because, that's like the most direct way to indicate that, this is something that is classic, that, is tried and true, right? That it has that warmth and that body to it that people in the 21st century struggle to try to manufacture. Everybody's shooting digital, and they apply filters that look like analog. Same thing with music production. It's like everybody does all this high energy compressed, stuff, and then they put vinyl crackles on top of it, right? It's crazy to me. So that's why I try to make sure that I employ cameras that give me that feeling instantaneously, that I don't have to try to go back with. So on occasion I will shoot manually as opposed to using the autofocus and all that kind of stuff, because I want some blur, I want some glare, I want things that would be seen as imperfections, because they're not just feel, but they are more authentic to what I'm doing, as opposed to letting the camera do all this stuff and try to figure out what's what, and to fix, quote unquote, things that may be viewed as being wrong. Again, I like evidence of the artist's hand and thinking, because in a way that is my way of reflecting the idea that photography is closer to reality, because we know there's a person, a human being on the other side of that lens. And that is what the connection is that human beings have with photography that makes it so resonant, is that, you can look at it and you can get a sense that you might know that person, or someone like that person, of that height, of that complexion, of that age, and that location. And that paintings that are executed from photographs, are obviously filtered through the artist's mind and imagination, regardless of how photorealistic they are. They are still not the photograph, but there's something much more tangible and believable, for lack of a better word, with than we will ever have with the most hyper-realistic paintings that exist.
Yeah, a lot of times the photograph kind of becomes a stand-in for someone. Like we'll refer to them as that person rather than a photograph of the person, where I don't know if I hear that with painting as much.
Exactly. And then we start having that conversation about what's real and what's not, and thinking about the compression of the flattening of the image, which is something that we tell our painting majors when we try to get them to shoot all their reference images. Like, well, the the photograph is, no matter how well executed it is just a reference for the thing that you're supposed to be creating, because there's some element of the original objects that are compressed and flattened and that are removed. You have to, put those elements of humanity back into the photograph that you're trying to turn into a painting. And that's something that we like to try to highlight, but we want to remind students of their agency in the creative process, that the photograph is not figuring everything out for you, right? Running it through the filter is not figuring everything out for you. You have to do some level of work in order to make this thing a reflection of you as an individual who is, trying to tell this story using this imagery.
Yeah. Is there any other work that you'd like to take a look at in this group here?
Let's go to the found object stuff, I think, right quick.
Oh, okay. Sure. Right here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So most of these pieces, while representational, are part influenced by a image, while not specifically photographic. So, the first image up at the top is the first in a series that is called Postmortem Discourse. And it is a reinterpretation of the illustration of Little Black Sambo that was then taken mascot by the hip hop group KMD, which MF Doom was a member of in his early incarnation. And so because, these pieces are created from, repurposed chairs, the original piece, which is this one here, found itself in my studio from a peer in my grad school cohort. And he brought this chair in and he said, I know you're making stuff out of stuff. And I found this thing when I was refurbishing this house. And I thought you might want to see if you could do something with it. And, it sat there for a while, and I finally turned around and looked at it. And then I wound up seeing this face. And in that face, it went into more faces. And then, the series was born. But it made me think about, the way that we talk about representation and how you can see something reflective of humanity in things that, are not obviously, biological organisms, right? There's this way that anthropomorphize, a variety of things. And what happens when you take those images and you extrapolate the meaning in a million one different directions. So in the same way that I was thinking about using Photoshop to create layers from those original drawings that I did in that drawing class in undergrad, I started thinking about the same possibilities of alchemizing this found object stuff with these images that I've been amassing from resources from art history courses and art appreciation courses that I wanted to use to try to tell a broader story about the way that we think of the representation of people of African descent, not just people of African descent, but more people that are contained in people's minds within these stereotypes, and how do we explode those stereotypes by reimagining those things and some people wouldn't expect to experience them in, right? And so this is the foundation of this series that has been going on since the early 2000s, and most of the stuff that I'm passionate about has really been since undergrad, quite honestly. Aside from this piece, these pieces, there's some echo that continues through. The silhouette that is in my logo is actually a reduced photograph from Rap Pages magazine, which no longer exists. But there was a photo spread that they did one year where they went to Jamaica, and there's a photograph of these school kids waiting, on the street, and in the fold is a photograph, or part of a photograph of this little, schoolgirl. And so I wound up copying that image and enlarging it in the old days when you could go to the copy center and in college, and made it like 11 by 14, and extended the copy and completed the shape, and wound up scanning that and turning it into this digitized version of a silhouette that had been, completely, reduced over time. And so, there's always some echo of photography in most of the stuff that I do in some form of fashion.
I think these are really interesting pieces. On the other end of it, like the way that they become more accessible to wider audiences that they then become photographs again.
Exactly. And then you start thinking about the technical aspect again. It's like, can I get a photograph that accurately represents what the sculpture is doing in a three-dimensional space, which is a challenge in and of itself. But it does allow you to extend that conversation. The sculpture can't be in multiple places at one time. And that's also, one of the things that I love about, photography is that on occasion I can find some, composition out of nature that may convey an idea that I have in a different body of work. And I can share that photograph, and it will resonate with people in a way that the collage or the sculpture or the Rorschach test or whatever it is, just doesn't resonate with people. And so, that again makes me think about, that we talk about photography being like the most democratic art form. So as you stated, everyone has a camera in their phone now. And even before that, people, who didn't have access to portrait painters could, take their change and put on their best clothes and go to a photo studio and sit still for a little while. They had a documentation of their existence, which is one of the other reasons that I love, photography, not just, from the documentarian view, but the way that, having that object can also be therapeutic in a different way for people who don't get a chance to see themselves represented in society on any scale, let alone a larger scale. And even within the context of the visual and performing arts, that, you can have a documentation of your existence in the way that you want to be presented, and then have that distributed so that people can see you as you're seen, which is powerful.
That's how we got to Instagram, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
These are really cool. I really appreciate the way the faces kind of come through.
Mm.
Wow, that one's really interesting. Is that like a stencil spray paint?
It is.
Yeah.
It's like several that, have absolutely no, well, I shouldn't say that. In its inception, they had absolutely no relationship to each other. I just had all these random stencils that I cut. And I think this is one of those chair seats that wound up being completely different than the other chairs that I'd worked with before. And so I felt like I needed to do something to help differentiate it. And so I started layering, the spray paint, and then I cut some stencils that I had left over from some collages that I'd done, and I hadn't thrown away yet. And I said, well, let me, put this stuff on here and see what happens. And so that was how this piece wound up being born.
Yeah, I like that comparison you made to Photoshop too, because I can kind of see like you've got this base layer of the seat, and then you start adding all these other things. So I'm thinking about the way that you build this and the way that you might make a collage in Photoshop, but in the real life, right?
Exactly. Well, I'm always thinking about, the push and pull, which of course is what the layering is all about. It's like, can I make fabric do that is relative to the way that we play with opacity in Photoshop? What can I do with a composition with regard to light and shadow? It also has that same, immediacy with regard to the push and pull that allows for some dynamics in the image that will resonate with people when they look at it. And that's something that always kind of, processing when I'm focusing in on images that are important to me with regard to photography. Now, when I'm photographing birds and clouds and stuff, that's generally not something I'm thinking about. But when I'm doing the landscape photography stuff, that is important, in particular the urban landscapes, because I'm trying to also document and capture, the beauty in things that we find ugly, all these spaces that have been abandoned that used to be something. So you have the layers of paint, you have the layers of time, and just the historical memory that are that thing that we're trying to capture and compress and present to people, so they can experience it and hopefully find a way to peel back those layers for themselves and see what's in there, right? That that there's something that may resonate with the individual that they probably had never thought about before, because they walked by this space that used to be a drugstore, used to be a tire shop, or whatever the deal is. Especially when you come from small southern towns, there's so many places that exist like that. And being in North Louisiana, being in Monroe, Louisiana, there are a lot of the small towns in between here in South Louisiana that feel and look like other small southern towns across the southern part of the United States that used to be a place, and they have all of these stories that are embedded in them that are just waiting to be told through some sort of documentation.
When I was looking through your work, I definitely got a sense of the South all the way through it. And I was wondering if maybe you wanted to talk about like how your relationship to the South informs a lot of this work. I know you just kind of touched on it a little bit, but I don't know if there's any other work you want to visit that kind of helps address that.
Let's take a look at the stamps paid stuff. And some of those, let's go to one of those fans, maybe.
One of the fans?
Yeah.
This one work?
That'll work.
Okay.
So I will say that most of the work that I've done has again gone back to ideas that I've formulated in undergrad, thinking about what my responsibility was as coming from a particular place, but also acknowledging that I probably want to use my work to be a teaching tool, for lack of a better term. How art can be a teaching tool, and this is before coming into the classroom. So I wound up making, as part of my BFA senior exit show, these large scale pastel drawings that were reflected images of the American flag and the Confederate flag. And, it was presented in a frieze with, a large scale reinterpretation of that silhouetted figure on either side. And one of my classmates said that, that work made his parents, who he described as being openly bigoted, reimagine the way that they thought, right? Thought about Black people. And number one, I was not expecting that. That was not I guess it was the intention of the work, but it was not something that I thought might be an outcome. And so that really kind of, gave me the impetus to keep making the kind of work that I wanted to make, that, as forthrightly as possible, talked about the experience of African descent, not just in America and the South, but in America. And, how so much of the South is still connected to the rest of America, but, people in certain places in the country just don't acknowledge that or see it. Specifically thinking about spirituality and religion, the threads of traditional African, spiritual practices, and also, this idea of transitioning from one space to the other, migration, and how those things overlap and intersect, and how the places that we find ourselves are often, political and social ramifications that we may not have any control over. And so all of the work not all, but the vast majority of the work that I've done in some form or fashion addresses that. It was really when I wound up moving to Louisiana, because I didn't feel like a lot of the students that I was interacting with, had a real sense of that, especially with the way that, it is related to artwork. And particularly thinking about artists like David Hammonds, or Jean-Michel Basquiat, or Carol Walker. Like, students will react to the work, but they weren't really understanding how that work is connected to the African-American experience through the transatlantic slave trade, but also, through these migratory efforts coming from the Caribbean or coming from places of the South, and what that meant with regard to the work that they were now experiencing as being, staples in these pop cultural moments that everybody was engaging with, and so I wanted to as a charge to myself, make sure that I was creating things that, talked about, where I came from in Walton County, but also how I saw parallels between, my existence as a young person growing up in the 1980s and 90s in Georgia, were similar to experiences that some of my peers were having here, and what that means with regard to how we see ourselves and where we find ourselves. And religion, again, wound up being like one of the primary representations of that. So the church fan is something that I wound up employing as a substrate in grad school. I'd previously been working as an educational counselor for the TRIO program, which is part of Upward Bound. And I was preparing a lecture on Emmett Till, and one of the students said, I learned about him through that Kanye West song. And this was in the late 1990s. I'm like, why are you learning about Emmett Till through hip hop?
Right.
Why are you not learning about this in class? And so it was at that moment that I thought, well, if I'm thinking about this through an artistic lens, how can I compress this story about not just who Emmett Till was, but what was happening at that time, and also where the lapse is between what is happening in the classroom during this period of time and what information these kids are getting when they're not in school, right? And so the initial fans that I made were a diptych. On one fan is the image of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X meeting, and on the other fan is an image of the Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac meeting, because there are parallels and inverse relationships between those individuals. And I wanted to try to figure out how to simplify this representation of pop cultural figures, societal figures, and have a literal space in between so that people could negotiate, how we decide, who we want to listen to, who we put our trust in, and where do we draw our values from. And then that kind of generating a conversation. And so that laid the foundation for a wide variety of other fans that I've made, some of which are reinterpretations of the Confederate battle flag, also reinterpretations of flags that have representations of countries that were colonizers of Asian spaces, indigenous spaces, and African spaces, and providing a platform for the viewer to try to peel back the layers again about how politics and religion as a colonizing force go hand in hand. And, those things are some of the subjects that I'm still playing around with as well. Every now and again, I'll find some abandoned, church when I'm driving down a back road in Louisiana here, and I'll stop and photograph it, because, it's a reminder to me that, there are more churches than there are a lot of other structures, not just in the South, but in America, and thinking about all the narratives that are woven in those spaces, and, the different interpretations of spirituality and religion that come from that one singular place, as opposed to the broader conception of what Christianity or Islam or Judaism is supposed to be, right? And giving people, again, room to kind of negotiate some of those ideas when I try to highlight some of those ideas that I find, glaring through the history.
I think it's a really interesting concept to use the fan. And this one that we're looking at right here, is that a piece of is that like a cutout with a sheer fabric?
It is.
It is. Okay.
Yeah. It's a cutout.
And is the idea that when the fan is in use, it allows some ideas to kind of be pushed forward where others kind of go through and things like that?
So, the fan used as a tool of instruction, but also as meditation as well. Thinking about palm fronds being used at Easter also. And, the traditional church fan, as we think about it, specifically in the Black churches, you have an advertisement on the back. Then on the front, you have these images of Martin Luther King, or, a family praying in a pew, or whatever the case may be. So, there are multiple messages that are being conveyed through this one object, right? And in particular for this series of the fans, I have, as the base layer in this collage, all of these stamps that I've collected over the years that all have images, representational images of African Americans in them. And most of them are either, based on photographs or taken from photographs. And, thinking about those individuals as waymakers, but also thinking about the stamp as a tool for transport. That these are all metered stamps that have been somewhere and traveled. And again, thinking about this idea of migration and freedom and liberation, right? Which is also a part of this conversation about religion being used as a tool of liberation as well.
Oh, I really appreciate the layering of that, the transport tool. That's a really interesting idea.
Thank you.
I just kind of clicked on this first one here, but should we click through just a couple more?
I'm trying to remember what I have in here. Let's
Let me back out and
the charmed stuff. So again, yes, this is the silhouette, and this is probably like one of the better illustrations of what the original silhouette looks like, even from the original photograph that it's taken from. That it actually is an image of a schoolgirl that I wind up, extrapolating and reimagining as both a masculine and a feminine figure. And over time, the crown wound up being added. So that crown, again, brings us back to the conversation about using photography in Photoshop, is that it is a cast-off piece of wood being used to construct stairs for a house. My uncle was building a house. The uncle that's a photographer was building his house out in the woods. He had all this miscellaneous stuff. He said, I know you're making this stuff in grad school. Do you want this? And so I took the things because, I'm one of those artists that collects junk. And
aren't we all?
Yeah, we are really all the same person. And so it was sitting in the studio for a while, and I thought, it looks kind of like a crown, but of course I didn't really make the connection between the silhouette and actually placing it on him. So I made these small crown-like figures that were individual sculptures that were mounted directly on the wall and had collages on top of them. And then I wound up photographing the thing, editing it in Photoshop, and adding the additional points. So the original crown is actually a piece of wood that was photographed at Cedar Street at the University of Georgia, and has been digitized 1 million times. And so the being able to capture an object, or an image, an idea, and reimagining it, and then literally turning it into something else a bunch of different times, is the power of the photographic medium. Again, thinking about Alfred Stieglitz, and thinking about the way that Man Ray used photography, Marcel Duchamp, all these folks, Asher Cowens, photography is so immediate and so powerful in a way that other mediums really are not, regardless of, but sometimes independent of the way that we think about how photography is used, right? That you can really take it and stretch it in so many different directions, even if it's just going into the dark room and hand editing a negative, or painting on it, or scratching into it after you processed it, right? There's something that's much more tangible and immediate in that process than, again, making a photorealistic painting from that photograph, I think.
I'm just going to click through a couple of these here.
So these pieces were pre-visualized in Photoshop, compositing, images that I shot and other reference material. And then proceeding to try to, as best as possible, mimic the transparency, or what the transparency would feel like and what it could offer in a two-dimensional form.
Is this like a wallpaper or something?
So that's actually upholstery fabric that
okay.
One of my former colleagues gave me because she knew I was making crap. She was also our costume designer on the theater side. She said, I have all this leftover fabric that we're not going to do anything with. I'm going to throw it away. Do you want it? And I was like, well, yeah, I'm trying to find some new stuff to paint on. And so that was how those were born.
I noticed there's like a beetle shape that's kind of reoccurring in these. Is it okay to ask about that? Yeah,
that's just a scarab.
Okay.
And scarab is associated with death. And I placed it in the crosshair for that purpose, to kind of reiterate this idea of death, but also thinking about death being the portal to rebirth. There's this cyclical nature of life, that we are born, we die, and then we make the transition to the spiritual plane, but also make the space available for another soul to enter. And most of the time when I'm working on a series, I try to have some sort of balance. So this is king on this side, and then the other image was a queen. And there are usually some other visual signifier that is associated with the individual that's represented, especially if it's a deity. So there's references to numerology, or Yoruba deities, kings and queens, gods and goddesses, and the values that are used in those images also, references to those deities as well. So, this piece in particular also has the cowrie shells, which are used for divination, but also uses currency.
Cool. Yeah, I was going to ask about those next now. Thanks for getting ahead of me. All right. Well, we are just about an hour, recording. So
that was fast.
It goes quick, right?
It does go quick.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch us back to this view here. And one of the ways I like to end each show is to just see if you have any advice for up and coming creatives.
The best advice I can give is to, some of the best advice I can give is to try not to second guess yourself. I was going to say don't second guess yourself, but it's a fool's errand because we all do it. The older that I've gotten, the more that I've learned to, acknowledge that you should always trust your intuition. This is something that I tell art appreciation students all the time. It's like, don't second guess your answer. 9 times out of 10, the answer that you've chosen is correct. If you mark the wrong thing, then, it's not my responsibility to go back and try to fix what you selected, right? That your gut tells you what you should be doing. And most often, especially when I was in, grad school in particular, I was surrounded by a lot of people who were trying to find shortcuts to, quote unquote, make a good, piece of art, or to make a piece of art that was going to get them to a certain, rung on the ladder, instead of making things that satisfy their soul. And then, after so many years of trials and tribulation, even, so many years of success, they eventually had to come back and make the stuff that they really were interested in that may or may not have been, commercially viable, to some degree. And I figured that, the simplest thing to do is to always honor that feeling, always honor that instinct, make the things that are important to you, because the world is, full of people. There are billions of people on the earth. And there's someone who wants the things that you make or want to make as they come to you initially, without any filtering, without any compromise, without any augmentation. And the sooner you understand that, believe it, and act on it, the sooner that you'll make the kind of work that really satisfies your soul and will make it easier for you to keep making in a world that, tries to get artists and creatives of every stripe not to make stuff, right? So that's like the best advice I can give, is to do the thing that you really know at the center of yourself, you're supposed to be doing.
Oh, that's great. As we close up, is there anything coming up that you'd like people to know about, or a way that you want people to follow you?
The next thing I have coming up is a residency. I was selected for the Hambidge residency at Raven Gap. So
congratulations.
Thank you. I'll be heading there in a week or so, actually. And I'll be disconnected from everything in the world, thank God. So no overrides, no emails to check, none of that stuff, no schedules to work on. Just me in the studio, making a mess and trying to work on some larger, not trying to, but intending to work on some larger scale things, which is something that I don't have the luxury of doing in the studio space that I have right now, because it's a small space. So I'm usually kind of rotating things to kind of make room for the other stuff that I want to do. I'm going to make some larger versions of those fans. Trying to make some that are like 8 feet high. Just nice. To explore, thinking about scale and spectacle and what it means to have, just that dynamic shift, because a lot of the things that I work on, if not all of them, still are fairly relatable in size, that it's easy for people to grasp. But I want to, explore exploding some of those ideas and expectations about what happens when you take things and you make things larger. A la, Klaus Oldenburg. So that's what's coming up next. And next year, those solo shows coming up. So my intention is to, lay the foundation for some of the stuff I'm going to have in these solo shows. Comes out of the residency here.
Well, good luck. I hope that goes really well.
Thank you. I'm expecting good things.
Oh, that's great. Well, it was really nice to get to know your work and chat with you today, and I just appreciate you making time to be on the show.
Well, thank you. It was nice chatting with you. Nice to meet you too. And I look forward to hearing from you again.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for checking out this episode of Focus Stacked, and we'll see you on the next episode. If you enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and leave us a comment. It helps us connect with more photography lovers just like you.